Welcome to Polaris-Live. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmeri, with conversations on the U.S.-China relationship and its global impact, as seen through the eyes of experts from around the world. This viewer-supported channel is brought to you in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. Let me remind our viewers that we are coming to you live, so if you have any questions, please ask them using the bar on the right-hand side of the screen. My guest today is the well-known Indian analyst, writer, and commentator, Mr. Luv Puri. Luv has worked in the field of international affairs, was with the UN Department of Political Affairs for 10 years. During this period, he worked at the highest levels of multilateral diplomacy, including as part of the Secretary General's team. He's authored two books, including Across the Line of Control, published by the Columbia University Press. He comes to us from Kashmir, India. Welcome back to Polaris Live, Mr. Puri.
Hello, Sarwar. How are you doing?
I'm doing
Thanks
quite
for
well.
having me.
Yeah, you're high up in the Himalayas today. Is it as cold as it is here?
Actually, I'm in Delhi right now. So yeah, I was in J&K a few days ago. Right now,
Oh,
I'm in Delhi. Yeah,
okay.
New
Well,
Delhi. Yeah.
yeah, I'm about to ask you, I'm glad you're in Delhi, that India heads to the polls over the next 2 months for the largest election in the world, in the largest democracy in the world. Now, people are referring to it lately as a Bollywood election. What gives, Love?
Yeah, it's a movie act being played every day, like for the last 2 months or 3 months. Two former chief ministers, are behind bars. There are
Wow.
other events taking place. There are a whole set of issues that have come up. Opposition is alleging that they are being denied a level playing field. The government is saying that they are not doing anything. It's just the usual law enforcing agencies. They're doing their what they have to do. So every day, there's some new development. Like for instance, the Congress parties, cannot have access to its funds because the tax authorities have slapped notices that they haven't paid previous taxes. So, opposition is again, as I said earlier, is alleging that they are being denied level playing field.
But
So yeah.
Mr. Puri, when India was set up as a democracy, all of the English balances and checks and balances were put into place. So, what's happening? I mean, what's happening to all of these checks and balances? The Supreme Court?
There's no doubt about that. New norms have been established. There were norms which prevailed and which continue to play out for many decades of Indian democracy, as you said. In the last few years, I think in the last maybe 3, 4 years, I think new norms have come into being. And those checks and balances, which are like the essential part of any democracy, they're not playing their effective role. They are not making sure that the a kind of no one institution kind of stretches beyond a particular boundary. So that is what is happening. But as you said, when you talk about invoke the Supreme Court, I must give credit to Supreme Court recently. What they did, there's something called electoral bond, which is very similar to super PACs in the US. Not exactly the
Hmm.
same, but it talks about the corporate financing to the political parties. So right a few days ago, Supreme Court called it illegal, and a plethora of information came out of it, because Supreme Court asked the bank authorities to reveal the names. There are other things happening, I think viewers can just do a random Google, they'll find out what all is happening. For instance, many companies that paid a particular party. Before that, they were raided. So there are allegations by the opposition that was extortion money. And this money runs in thousands. Like, we're talking about, millions of dollars out here. And
Mm,
that's like,
mm.
skews the funding to a particular party. But, as you said, Supreme Court, I think one check is definitely working.
So, Love, put on your intellectual hat for me for a second. It almost sounds like democracy can exist in many forms. I know in America, we've gone from a very staid, constitutional, no money involved, almost no money involved democracy to where lots of big corporations seem to define what's about to take place. Same thing from what you say is happening in India. And so, do you think that democracies are not set in stone, that over time, 30, 40, 50 years, they adapt to the mood?
Uh, I don't I don't call it like I think I have a different interpretation. There are things that like when you talk about India, there are things that have really worked. For instance, when India became independent, there was a small slice of elite that governed India. Slowly and steadily, what we have seen in the third world is that, the democracy just like percolates down the social hierarchies. So, the other marginalized communities become empowered. So that it's not, as you rightly said, it's not unidimensional, but, one of the essentials of any democratic system are the checks and balances. And whether that's American democracy or the British democracy or the Indian democracy, there are checks and balances that have to play an important role. And it cannot be a majoritarian polity. There are again checks to making sure that every community, every section of the society is not oppressed, is not victimized, and that's the essential part of any democracy. So I think that metric applies to all democracies.
That sounds very much like a phrase I heard recently about America, that we used to be governed by an elite that was all Yale and male and pale, if I will use that
Yes.
if we use that phrase. But we've transitioned, and so you're saying that's part of the democratic structure. But I was asking this, Love, because China maintains that it is a form of democracy and that no nation has a monopoly in defining what is or is not a democracy. What do you think of that?
See, like, like unpacking this, like, I think when it comes to China has like a distinct advantage of like, one particular race, like, which is around maybe 80%, one ethnic community living in that country. But when you talk about, when you talk about India, 1.4 billion, again, like, as I said last time, who's a majority, who's a minority, like, there's so many different languages spoken, like 24 languages, spoken across the breadth and the length of the country, ethnic diversity, other diversities. So I know what you're talking about. Like, many of my Chinese colleagues, during, my UN days or like, while I was studying in the US, they did talk about that we have our own kind of democracy.
Right.
But, it's very, that system can only play out in China, where there's like less of diversity. But when you talk about India or the US, I think those as I said, like those checks and balances are required. Even those checks and balances are required even in the Chinese system when we talk about the minorities even in China, like in the Muslim community, like for instance the Uyghur community and other communities living in the north. So those checks and balances apply to all democracies, whether it's US or it's China or it's any European country. We just cannot escape from that. And hmm.
But you made an interesting point here that I don't want to escape us, and that is that the Chinese system is unique to it because, as you point out, it's a very homogeneous Han. Chinese population. Does this mean that you agree with what many Chinese intellectuals say, is that China's democracy is unique to it, and therefore it cannot be exported, and China is not in that business as the Soviet Union used to be? What do you think?
Yeah, that's I agree on that front. Like, when it comes to kind of like what happened in the Cold War. Soviet Union was doing its own bidding, like spreading its idea of communist ideology, and the US was doing its own. So we all know about it. Like anyone who's lived, in that era knows about it. Like, what all was happening. So, but China is one country. It is like, known for like, it doesn't want to like, it's not similar to what happened in Cold War. It doesn't want to export its ideology. It when it goes to Africa, it's a transactional relationship. When it goes to other parts of the world, again, Latin America, it's a transactional relationship. Though in the neighborhood, there are concerns that, it has, kind of a hegemonistic attitude, like, when it comes to South China Sea, Philippines, India, Vietnam, and other countries, it has its own contestations over territories or islands. But, like, obviously, the status, what China enjoys today, like, as the second largest economy in the world, it cannot be, it is definitely not similar to, what Soviet Union and the US did, like, like having satellites across the world
Right.
or putting up proxies. Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
It's not in the business of having, exporting its ideology. Definitely, it's also, I think, it's in the DNA of, that the Chinese, like in the Middle Kingdom, they're content with that, like, in that respect. I think many scholars have written about that, because, like, if you see the history of that, they were always afraid of foreigners coming to their territory. They didn't venture out. It was the European colonists who came to many parts of Asia, including China.
Right. Right. And that's why they refer to that century of humiliation, which seems to define and influence a lot of their foreign policy. I'm going to remind our viewers that you're listening to Polaris Live, which is a viewer-supported channel, and that we would appreciate your signing up to receive our alerts by going to kashmiri.com, and also subscribe to Polaris Live channel on YouTube. None of that costs any money, but it really helps us to grow. I want to switch topics a bit, Ravi, if I may, or Luv, if I may. What is the prevailing view in India of the Gaza war, right? Recognizing that there are over 250 million Muslims in India, the second largest Muslim population. Can you enlighten us on that?
See, like historically speaking, there's no doubt about that. Like ever since Nehru, like, India's support for Palestine was unequivocal. India's always stood for two-state solution. There's no doubt about that. But to answer your specific question, ever since 7th October Hamas attack took place, there has been a kind of a calibrated shift of Indian official position. Like to start with, like I think each part of the world, was grappling with what has happened. They took a very strong stance against terrorism. Like they said that Hamas should not have done that. But slowly and steadily, as we saw, like what Israel did, like bombing civilian um, housing societies, and when uh, all those deaths were beamed across the world, I think Israel lost its sympathy. The same happened in India. So what happened was in October, India abstained from the resolution, like at the Security Council, and at the General Assembly. But in December, India supported the resolution in the General Assembly. So there has been a calibrated change, but that change has taken place, I think, in many parts of the world. But to begin with, there was kind of like sympathy for Israel, but it dissolved. It got diluted by December. And now India, stands with the majority of the world, the 80% of the nation that support there's a support for ceasefire, humanitarian access, making sure there's protection of civilians. So that's the official position. As I said, there's a shift, but there's a shift in a direction which brings back to what has India generally stood for. There's a sympathy for Palestinian cause, but when you talk about the larger society, I think overall there has always been support for to state solution, and the fact that the rights of Palestinian people should be upheld. But there is, India revived its relationship with Israel in early 90s during the Simarao's time. But that didn't mean that it diluted its stance on Palestine. So to answer your question, as we talk, it's more or less the same stance. There's no difference.
Yes, I know the Indian Foreign Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, has made big news in the West for his quotation when he was asked in Europe, why is India sitting on the fence? I'm referring now to the Ukraine-Russia war. And he replied that India is not sitting on the fence. We're standing on our ground. Right, and so just wanted to ease into that topic first by asking you: has the Indian view of Gaza changed what Indians think about America because of what is widely seen as the unequivocal support with arms and so on that the United States gives to Israel? And then I'm also going to let you talk about Mr. Jaishankar's view, which reflects what is now being called the global South or the global majority. And I want to ask you, as part two of this question, whether there is something to that there is a global South, a global majority. But let's ease into both of those.
I think both the questions are related, to an extent. As you said, as I said, there's a shift of Indian position. What they did in October, the stance they took in October, they abstained from the resolution which called for a ceasefire then. But now in December, they voted for the resolution, and even the U.S. has made that change in March 2024. So the point I'm making is that global South, when you talk about that, some of the countries, there's no homogeneous position of global South. India took its own position. South Africa took its own position in October in 2023. So in that respect, global South applies to some context, that term, but obviously not when it comes to situation like Gaza. As we have seen, the evidence says that. And secondly, I think, as you rightly said, I think you have to understand, in democracies, the official position cannot remain very different from what the position of the societies are. As I said earlier, any Indian kid who's done the schooling out, in India, has studied the contours of the Palestinian issue very well. So, it just unless the syllabus has altogether been diluted and changed, which I'm not aware of. So, in that respect, the society was sympathetic to what was happening to Palestinian people initially. Okay, the entire world, even in the Muslim world, was surprised for what Hamas did. But after that, the way they carried out their operations, there was no sympathy for Israel by November. So I think the Indian position, official position, tried to connect with what was the position of the larger society. There were protests. Initially, they did try to make sure that there were no protests in favor of Palestinian people in India. But no ruling party, even if it has like the number of seats it has
Hmm.
right now, BJP cannot remain totally indifferent to what the larger society feels. As far as you're saying, the Ukraine, so Gaza is definitely, I think the Indian official position has connected with the larger society's position that, there has to be, those civilians have to be protected. There's no
Right.
doubt about that, humanitarian access. So it's back to like, what used to be the traditional Indian foreign policy position on
Okay.
this issue, two nations theory, two nations solution. But when it comes to Ukraine, like again, like it's a real politics speaking. Trade with Russia, from January till September 2023 is 50 billion. And trade for the whole of 2023 with Ukraine is 3 billion. So, and 40, India's trade with Russia is 50 billion till September 2023. So, what are we talking about? We're talking about like maybe like 13 times, more than 13 times in the trade India has. And obviously, this is, I think, the bulk of it, 90% is crude oil import by India. It's skewed in favor of Russia. 46% is basically Russian export to India
Hmm.
and 4% Indian export to Russia. And there's a concern within this Indian establishment that the trade is skewed, is heavily skewed.
Hmm.
So that that has been said in the public domain. Like they have said that. So this is Jaishankar, like with his all his mastery over the subject of international affairs, 40 years experience, etc. So I think he was just like it's basically giving words to the reality, the bombastic words to the reality, and it's just like reiterating India's position. Russia has supported India, the United, UNSC, ever since 1950s. So, it just cannot go against Russia. The rest is like, like verbal acoustics, like, we can hear them, we can enjoy them.
But Love, let me also prolong this for just a little bit longer. In America, the view is that, okay, so it sounds like on Ukraine, India and Russia and China are on the same page. But India has this war going on, issue in Himalayas and so on. Is this too simplistic a view to take that because of India's position on Ukraine, which is not the same as the West, so in entirety, that India and China and Russia are kind of synchronized in some way?
Definitely not. Definitely not. There's no, they're not in sync. Like, obviously India and China, it better than me. Like, they're like huge, there's contestations taking place at various levels, not just territorial. There are other things too, trade, etc. too. Uh, but at the same point, these three countries are obviously not in sync. But at the same point, you must realize the establishment, even in the US, they want to use India, like to make sure that it can prevail on whatever Indian equities are with respect to the
Right.
you know with respect to Russia, like I don't like how much access they have, but at least because of the trade, they have some leverage. So India definitely has tried to exercise whatever in a they can do in a limited manner. Like the Prime Minister Modi has spoken to President Putin regularly, and he's also spoken to Ukrainian Prime Minister and to the Ukrainian President. At the same point, Ukrainian Foreign Minister was in India recently in
Hmm.
March. So that's important fact because they think that the India can be used to prevail on Russia to see reason what they think is reasonable approach that there shouldn't be any territorial annexation, etc., etc. So and they invited India to take to participate in the peace conference which is going to take place in Switzerland and sought their support for 10-point formula. Though, like Foreign Minister Jaishankar said that we are again in the Bollywoodish sprinkled elections this year. So we're not sure whether we will be able to attend or not, or what will be the level of our representation. So both the US as well as Ukraine, they realize that India has some influence over the Russian polity, and they can use it to their benefit. So, and beyond that, I don't think India can really, even if India would not have bought crude oil, it would not have made much difference because they would have found buyers, somewhere else.
Interesting. I'm going to connect this to my next question, which is you sent me a link recently in which I was surprised to read, Love, that there are more billionaires in Bombay now than there are in Beijing. Okay, in America, billionaires, huge contributions into elections. So it intrigues me to ask this question, that India and China and the United States have a widely differing governmental structure, governance structure. But all three of them seem to be headed in the same direction as far as their influence being not governed, but directed by billionaires. So I'm going to have you to stretch your intellectual thinking. Am I right?
Yeah, definitely. Like, who's ever seen the evolution of societies in all these three countries? This is happening. By the way, I was hearing your interview, and you were talking about, the number of billionaires in China. There, like I think in Beijing are more than New York, like sometime back, maybe in 2020. So I immediately, I remembered like, reading some news item about billionaires in Bombay. So that was that made me send that news item to you. Yeah, definitely. What is happening is that there is a concentration of wealth which is taking place, though there's enough written, what has happened in the U.S. And this debates are studied, discussions have been held, in a very granular manner. But in India, I think not much work is being done. What are the consequences of this concentration of wealth? Because it's primarily two companies right now which are leading the show, like, and everyone knows the names, like, so there is and there are others too, definitely. There are other billionaires too, 91 more billionaires maybe. But this tells us that there's a concentration of wealth. And as I talked about, then there are other issues too relating to the larger functioning of democracy. I refer to electoral bonds, because when you have so many billionaires, and the vast majority of the population is like, is lower middle class, or 20% of the population is below the poverty line, that has definite implications on the functioning of a democracy. So definitely, these things have to be taken care of to make sure that this concentration of wealth doesn't take place.
And so I find that intriguing, that way you can have an Indian style democracy, you can have an American style democracy, you can have a Chinese style governance or Chinese style democracy, but in the end, it's money that talks.
Yeah, but that should not be the case in a democracy. Like, there's an interesting thing. Like, when it comes to the US, if you have money, like, even if you are like super rich, there's like it's all relative. Their individual rights are assured. Social hierarchies are not as big as they are in India. So it takes a altogether a different equation when it comes to India, because the polity is, relatively speaking, it's corruptible as compared to the US, because other institutions are working, especially media and other institutions as well as judiciary. But in India's case, things are very different because you already have a system which is, we had like a for well, for so many ages we had like a caste system. There are other fault lines which exist in India. So if you have another fault line like this, and then individual rights, not assured, these have real-time consequences. So this has to be watched because many things will happen. Many unintended consequences will be there. And if you watch, like, the big wedding, which took place in India, that tells you, where, in which direction we are going. There's nothing wrong in spending your money, but then there were other stories too, like, because the people in question, it is alleged, like, for instance, they had elephant park or rehabilitation centers, but the wildlife folks who work in this area, they said, those people were just brought in over there. The elephants were brought in there, and they were not even injured. So, what are you talking about? You're playing with wildlife, you're playing with nature, and there are other consequences, like, which have to be studied in detail, and but they're playing out in front of you. These huge inequalities, because the polity is just not, it's just not prepared to handle this kind of a situation. At least in the US, other checks are there.
Well, I must tell you, I was very, very envious of Mr. Ambani's dancing skills. And so I appreciate your conversation. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, Luv Puri, but we've run out of time. And this triangle of the United States, India, and China, we'll return to that. And I hope you will come back to see us again. So thank you very much for your time.
It's always my pleasure, Sarwar.
And I want to thank our viewers from around the world. Please join us again on Polaris-Live.com as we continue to explore the most consequential relationship in the world, that between the United States and China, and its impact around the world. So until I see you next time, goodbye.